Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm David Rothkopf of Foreign Policy, and to kick things off, what I'd like to do is stroll over here, and hopefully we'll do a subtle, yes, the mic transition work, and have a conversation with Tony, who I've known for a long time, since we were in the Clinton administration together, as we like to refer to it, the first Clinton period. There could be another one. We're not going to discuss that here today, but rather we'll talk about the world. Since we're talking about big trends for much of the day, and Tony has got a brief and also an intellect that allows him to sort of view a lot of these things strategically, what I'd like to try to do is tie some of the headlines to those trends. Clearly, one of the issues that has been at the very forefront of the news recently is the potential for a nuclear deal with Iran. The administration has been working on this on multiple levels, as we've learned, with tough sanctions that have pressured the Iranians. I met with President Rouhani when I was in New York during UNGA, and it was very clear from them they were feeling the pressure of those sanctions, and that one of their great motivations was economic relief, but also behind-the-scenes discussions. And I was in the Middle East last week, and every single issue in the Middle East now seems to be viewed through the lens of this deal. I was in Israel, and they were saying, well, you know, Bibi Netanyahu's saying all these nasty things about the deal. Is that going to sidetrack our deal? We just did an event on Syria on Monday, and it's, well, is the U.S. going to cut a deal with the Iranians with regard to Syria one way or another, depending on this other deal? And so what I'd like to ask you about right now is how you see this 6-month negotiation evolving, and how connected is it to everything else?
First of all, it's great to be here, and I want to thank all of you for starting your day with us. Big ideas early in the morning can be a tough mix, but we'll do our best to make it go down easy. A couple of things I would say. First, what we're seeing now is the culmination of years of work and years of effort. As you said, the pressure that's built up on Iran over the years as a result of the coalition of countries that President Obama put together painstakingly over the last 5 years is what's got us to this point. In our judgment, President Rouhani was elected largely on a platform for change, economic change, a change of Iran's position in the world, a desire to move the country forward and in a different direction. And in Rouhani's estimation, that requires doing something about the sanctions to get the economy moving, and to do something about the sanctions, you've got to do something about the nuclear program. So that's where we are. We now have an interim agreement that I think, as all of you know, does several things. It halts the progress of Iran's nuclear program for the duration of the interim agreement. It rolls it back in certain key respects, and it gives the international inspectors the kind of access they've never had before. And what that means is it gives us time, 6 months, to see if we can negotiate a comprehensive solution without Iran using that period of time to continue advancing its program, to use the cover of negotiations to keep moving forward. That's something we also haven't had before. We'll see if we can get to a comprehensive solution, but meanwhile, in and of itself, this interim deal is a good thing. Let me say one thing about it, and then I'll answer the question about the other repercussions. When you think about it, we've heard, with regard to Iran's nuclear program, 3 primary concerns from some of our closest partners, concerns that we share. First, we heard that the biggest present danger was this growing stockpile of 20% enriched uranium. And I think everyone remembers Prime Minister Netanyahu more than a year ago at the United Nations General Assembly holding up that drawing of a bomb with a red line. And that represented the 20%. And if the 20% got above that red line, then there was concern that Iran could speed to a bomb. Well, this interim deal stops that in its tracks. No 20% enrichment, and indeed, the existing stockpile has to be converted or diluted. So that path to a bomb is interrupted for 6 months. Then we heard, actually, it's not so much the 20%, the real clear and present danger is this combination of a growing stockpile of 3.5% enriched uranium and more spinning centrifuges and the installation of advanced centrifuges. That, too, can put Iran in a place where it can speed to a bomb. Well, the interim deal stops that pathway as well. It caps the 3.5% enriched. Iran can't have any more 3.5% at the end of the 6-month period that it has today. It caps their ability to spin more centrifuges, to install advanced centrifuges. That pathway is cut off. And then finally, we heard actually the real problem is this Iraq plutonium reactor that is being built. That's the clear and present danger. And there too, the interim deal stops that in its tracks. No fuel can be made for Iraq, no fuel can go into Iraq, no components can be installed in Iraq. And so what we've managed—
This is a sophisticated group, but I want to underscore, you mean Iraq, A-R-A-K?
Yes,
right.
Let's, Iraq with we dealt with the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq with an I. Iraq with an A.
It is early in the morning, I want to ease people into it.
So, in and of itself, this is a strong and good agreement. Whether we can get to a comprehensive solution that gives the world the confidence it needs that Iran's nuclear program is exclusively for peaceful purposes is an open question. We'll see as we get there. Now, what about the repercussions? Look, a lot of this is very understandable. First, with regard to Israel. Iran with a bomb represents an existential threat to Israel. We understand that. Israel is right to be profoundly skeptical of anything having to do with Iran. And so when we talk to the Israelis, and we're in very close coordination with them, in fact, we have a delegation of very senior officials coming to Washington this week to talk about where we go next. We take on board all of these concerns. As I said, the primary concerns that Israel had in terms of the clearest pathways to a bomb have actually been addressed in the 6-month deal. Now the focus is on whether we can get to a satisfactory comprehensive solution. We'll be working very closely with Israel, with all of our partners, to look at what the elements would be that would give people confidence. The larger concern that you hear expressed in the region, particularly among our Arab and Gulf partners, is this. Their concern is that if we're able to reach a nuclear deal with Iran, we will then give Iran a free pass on everything else it does that is a problem for them and a problem for us. And the simple answer to that is we will not. Even if we get an enduring nuclear deal with Iran, we will still have a tremendous problem with Iran's activities around the world, its destabilizing activities, its support for terrorism. All of these issues have to be addressed. But think of it this way. Iran, without a bomb, or without a program that's on the verge of being able to make a bomb, has far less cover for these kinds of activities than it would otherwise. And so in and of itself, getting to a place where we've addressed the nuclear question may have beneficial impacts on things that everyone else is concerned about and we're concerned about too. And then there's a larger, more fundamental question that no one has the answer to. Is there a possibility that this engagement, that this effort, and a successful result on the nuclear file actually begins to change the politics and the foreign policy of Iran? That's a big open question. I don't put a lot of stock into a positive answer, but it's at least a possibility, and we should test it.
Okay, well, let's sort of go to the core assumption that you made a moment ago about approaching Iran with some degree of skepticism. And, you know, if you look at it over the course of the past 30 years, a lot of our foreign policy in the area has been aimed at containing Iran. And Iran's been able to do a lot of damage without having a nuclear weapon. So whether it's support of Hezbollah, it's support of destabilizing regimes, it's sort of hegemonic activities in the region, we've been concerned about that. The primary leverage we have is economic pressure, because you don't want to go to the kind of pressure associated with force, right? If you take away the economic levers, saying that they were all tied to the nuclear deal, what other levers? How do you enforce or express one's displeasure beyond, the occasional démarche saying, gee, we wish you hadn't destabilized that country. Gee, we wish, Hamas with your money was not undermining us in the pursuit of peace in Israel.
Two things to keep in mind. First, there are a whole series of sanctions and restrictions tied to Iran's activities in other areas outside of the nuclear area, including human rights, including support for terror, including destabilizing activities that don't go away, even if the nuclear sanctions do go away. So that's one. Those sanctions, that pressure will remain in place if Iran doesn't change its conduct. Second, and this is very important to keep in mind, the purpose of the nuclear sanctions is not regime change. It was not even to change the conduct of Iran's foreign policy. It was to see if we could get Iran to the table to negotiate in good faith an answer to the nuclear question and to give the world confidence in the peaceful purposes of the program. That's why countries around the world signed up to these sanctions. It wasn't easy to get them to join. As you all know, there's a lot of reluctance to join these efforts. The president, over 4.5 or 5 years, did this in a determined, painstaking manner. But the deal is this: if these sanctions get Iran to the table, then we have to be willing to test the proposition that they can answer the world's concerns. And if they answer the world's concerns on the nuclear question, then the sanctions related to that question have to be dealt with as well. So if we continue to raise the bar on the nuclear sanctions, that is, we said, satisfaction on the nuclear file is not enough. You have to do everything else with regard to any relief on the nuclear sanctions. We would lose the very partners we need to enforce the sanctions, the partners we need to make the sanctions meaningful.
So the administration had faced some potential pressure from the Hill, where there was this threat of additional sanctions being sort of put in place so that if after 6 months you didn't actually achieve the goals, those might go into place. And there was a behind-the-scenes negotiation, and people on the Hill said, okay, we're not going to put those in place, but based on, I presume, discussions with and some pressure from the administration. But going around the region, particularly those skeptical, I think their biggest worry is not that there will be no deal or that there will be a deal, but that there will be a little progress and kicking the can down the road. So you get to 6 months, you say there's a little progress, let's do another 6 months, you get another 6 months. The Iranians are getting time, which plays to their advantage in some levels, because even if you're not enriching, you can be developing capabilities in certain kinds of other ways. When is enough enough? When is the United States going to say, okay, we've tried the diplomatic means, this hasn't worked, we're going to have to take another measure?
So the interim agreement we reached can be extended, but only by mutual consent. In other words, we have to agree to extend it, our partners have to agree, P5+1 have to agree to extend it. If we're at a point in 6 months where we're on the verge of getting what we believe is a strong, comprehensive agreement, and it requires a little bit more time, that's something we wouldn't rule out. But if it's clear over the 6 months, and I think it will become clear, that Iran is not engaging in good faith, that the standards we would require, the limits and checks and verifications we would insist on, that Iran is not prepared to go there, we'll know that. And if that's the case, we will have tested the proposition, and we will have found that we can't get there, and Iran won't get there. I think in that instance, it will be very clear to our partners in this process, to the rest of the international community, that Iran is the recalcitrant party. The sanctions that we have in place now, which will continue to be vigorously implemented during the 6 months, will continue, and I suspect new sanctions would be added very, very quickly if at the end of this process Iran is not able to do what it needs to do. But we'll be able to know that. I don't want to prejudge where this goes, but there are very clear requirements, and we'll know whether Iran's prepared to meet them.
And do you believe, as just a matter of policy, that the use of force becomes a more credible option after one can say all diplomatic avenues have been exhausted?
Yes, absolutely. I think what's been so important in this process over the last 5 years is we've gone from a place where the United States was perceived, wrongly, but nonetheless perceived as being, if not the problem, at least a significant part of the problem, as being a recalcitrant party in trying to engage Iran on its nuclear file, to a place where Iran is isolated on this question. The unity of the P5+1 has been extraordinary. We've seen it in action in Geneva. And we're at a place now where, as a result of the pressure that was exerted by a unified group, including countries that, like China, like India, like South Korea, like Japan, who have very serious equities on the other side, we've turned this from a place where the U.S. was perceived as part of the problem to a place where Iran is the problem. And in order to keep that going, it's vitally important that we test this proposition, that diplomacy can get us to a successful result. And if we test it and Iran proves recalcitrant, that makes it easier to sustain support for other actions going forward.
Okay. Now, I don't want to dwell on just one issue, and I have promised that we're going to get everybody involved here, and I think in about 15 minutes we'll do it. I just want to take 3 or 4 other issues and look at them to some extent. When President Obama ran for office, there were kind of a couple core foreign policy ideas in what he was running for. One of them, running for, One of them was engagement. And indeed, Iran was what we talked about during the campaign as engaging with, and it's clear that something new is happening here. Where it goes remains the question. But the other core was getting out of Iraq, we're getting out of Afghanistan. And we are now at a very fragile moment with regard to Afghanistan. The Hamid Karzai either has the worst press spokesperson in the world, or may himself be the worst press spokesperson in the world, or he's deliberately, sticking his thumb in the eye of the United States on a fairly regular basis. And this leads to a natural reaction on the part of the United States and people politically, not just in the White House, but people elsewhere in Washington that say, let's be done with these guys. They don't appreciate us. We're just leaving. We're getting out. And when Susan Rice went over there, that was part of the thing. Maybe we'll just accelerate this and we'll get out. But we have this other thing, which hasn't gotten as much attention as it might, which is the example of Iraq. We got out of Iraq, and every day people are being killed in Iraq. And Iraq seems quite unstable. And the instability of Syria is playing into Iraq, and the instability of Iraq is playing into Syria. And there's questions now beginning that, well, did we get out too quickly? Should we have left troops there? And I'm just wondering about how are the lessons of Iraq informing where we are in Afghanistan?
First, let's put this in context. When we took office, there were about 150,000 U.S. troops in Iraq, and we reached a peak a little bit later of about 100,000 troops in Afghanistan. Now, as you said, there are no troops, no U.S. troops in Iraq. We'll be down to about 34,000 early next year in Afghanistan, on our way to drawing down. And then we come to this question about whether there will be any kind of residual presence. Small, very focused, as the President has said, on 2 missions, continuing to train Afghan forces and counterterrorism or not, and that depends on whether we get a bilateral security agreement that gives our troops that would remain the protections they must have anywhere in the world, and whether President Karzai is prepared to move forward on that. But let's step back and think about Iraq and what the implications may be for Afghanistan. And I saw Jim Jeffrey in the room earlier, who was our ambassador to Iraq during a very tumultuous period. We worked very closely together. And I think there are a number of lessons that are instructive. First of all, and it's hard to even wrap your mind around this, because the only thing you read about Iraq these days, when you read anything at all about Iraq, is another bomb going off. But there have been fundamental changes in Iraq over the last few years, and they're actually largely positive, despite this violence and despite, unfortunately, the reemergence, in particular, of al-Qaeda in Iraq, in part fueled by what's going on in Syria. First, despite all of Iraq's travails, politics has actually taken hold and has somehow survived even this uptick in violence. The different groups continue to transact most of their business through the political process, through Iraq's institutions, as imperfect as they may be, as difficult as it may be to do that. Sunni, Shia, Kurds are all working within those institutions that we helped develop. That center is held, despite, again, the tremendous tensions and the tremendous frustrations, including frustrations, of course, with the government and its lack of inclusiveness in a number of areas. So that's one. Two, what you haven't seen yet, and I'm knocking on this table, is despite—
Which has no wood.
Which has no wood, but I see I'm hopeful nonetheless that works. The violence that we've seen reemerge has not sparked a sectarian cycle of revenge. The Shia militia, who've been part and parcel of this cycle in the past, have continued to stand down. And so unfortunately what we're seeing, and more unfortunately what the Iraqi people are experiencing, is this surge in violence from AQI, which is trying to destabilize Iraq, trying to light a sectarian fuse, and so far it's not succeeded. But there's a real danger that happens, and that's what we need to guard against. Third, the other positive is Iraqi energy production has gone up significantly to the point where the combination of Iraq increasing its production and its exports and the pressure on Iran to decrease its own exports has resulted in Iraq overtaking Iran as a larger exporter. And Iraq has the potential, if, a big if, it can get its act together over the next few years, including this very elusive hydrocarbons law, to become, after Saudi Arabia, the major oil producer in the region. So there's tremendous potential there. There's also been tremendous progress between Iraq and its neighbors. Kuwait, the settlement of long-standing, outstanding issues. United Arab Emirates, Jordan, the relationships, Turkey most recently. The relationships are much more productive. Now, the fact of the matter is,
Don't leave out Iran. We don't.
and I'll come to that because that's important. U.S. troops. First, it was vitally important that Iraq regain its sovereignty. That was, in large part, the purpose of the exercise. And Iraq made a sovereign decision that it was not prepared to give us the kind of protections we needed in order to keep troops there. They made that decision through their political system, and we respected it. We made it very clear what we required. They were not able to go there. If we still had troops in Iraq today, the numbers would have been very small. They would not have been engaged in combat. That would not have been their mission. And so the idea that they could or would have done something about the violence that's going on now in Iraq seems to me to be detached from the reality of what the mission would have been had they stayed in any small number. So I don't think that would have answered the problems of Iraq today. What we're seeing is an interesting phenomenon. In an effort to regain their sovereignty, I think Iraqis wanted to set the clock back to zero in terms of their relationship with us. They wanted to see if we were good on our word. We said that we would get out of Iraq's cities back in 2009. No one believed that we would. We did. Then we said we'd get down to 50,000 and end our combat mission a couple of years later. People didn't believe that we would do that. We did. And then we said we would be out of Iraq at the end of 2011 unless we were invited to stay by the Iraqis. No one believed we would do that. We did. That's built up a tremendous amount of credibility. And what we've seen in recent months is that the Iraqis increasingly are looking for our help in a way they weren't before to deal with this emerging or re-emerging problem of terrorism. Unfortunately, a lot of this is fed by the conflict in Syria. That makes it much more complicated. It requires the neighbors to be involved to help find a solution. So that leads us to Afghanistan. The President's been very clear about this, that we've made a tremendous investment in Afghanistan, in blood, in treasure, in time. We've made a commitment to end our combat mission there, to end the war there, and we will do that. But we also have a commitment to Afghanistan, to remaining engaged, to continuing to help it develop its institutions, including its security forces. And we have an abiding interest and an enduring interest in making sure that the terror threat that emerged from Afghanistan doesn't reemerge there. That's why we're prepared to continue after 2014 to train and prepared to continue to be able to prosecute the counterterrorism.
I don't mean to interrupt, but just as we come to sort of the end of this particular answer, one thing I'd particularly like you to address is you describe Iraq, and while it's a country that's been ravaged by war and has faced a lot of struggles, it is nonetheless possible to say that Iraq has a lot of advantages that Afghanistan doesn't have, in terms of oil, in terms of certain kinds of institutional structures, in terms of certain kinds of international relations. And I'm just wondering, you know, Afghanistan has many of the same problems that we faced in Iraq, and then some, and fewer advantages. And so if you pull out the rug completely, isn't there a greater chance of chaos and an unpleasant outcome there?
In many ways, it is a tougher challenge. You're exactly right. You had literacy rates in Iraq that were about 80%, in Afghanistan about 20%. You had a tradition of governance, of bureaucracy, of administration in Iraq for all of its manifest problems that were lacking in a centralized state in Iraq, which you lack in Afghanistan. So for sure, there are deficits that make it even more of a challenge. And then, of course, you have the neighbors who all have their own interests and their own objectives in Afghanistan. So the challenge is acute. On the other hand, we've made significant progress given the investment we made in Afghanistan's institutions, including its security forces. That's demonstrated. The question is, can it be sustained, and then can it become self-sustained? Again, we think that Afghanistan would benefit tremendously from the commitments the international community made in Tokyo, Chicago through the security partnership, strategic partnership we agreed to with Afghanistan, but they have to make a decision, a sovereign decision about whether they want that going forward. Ultimately, that's up to them. We heard the Council of Elders, the Loya Jirga, resoundingly, overwhelmingly support the bilateral security agreement. But it is now the role of the President Karzai, to decide whether he wants to move forward and sign that. And the ball is in his court.
Okay, there are a lot of other questions about the Middle East that I think ought to be raised, questions about the expansion of Al-Qaeda and other kind of extremist groups, questions about Syria, questions about Egypt, questions about not just Sunni Shia tensions, but tensions within Sunnis, between the moderates, between more extreme groups. But we've got a Middle East panel for that. Ambassador Ann Patterson is on that panel. Derek Chalet from DoD is on that panel. Vali Nasser is on that panel. So I'm going to stipulate that we'll cover some of those later, and you may want to cover some in a couple of questions. But I want to ask one more question, and then I want to turn to the floor and get a couple questions from you. And someone will, the way we'll do this is you raise your hand, and someone will pass among you with a microphone, and you can pose quick questions, no speeches. But let me, to use a favorite term of our pivot for a second, to Asia-Pacific region. I was just having breakfast with a former senior official from Asia just now, and he was sort of scratching his head saying, I'm not really sure what's going on with this Chinese air defense zone issue. It looked like the Chinese overplayed their hand. When the US overflew, they didn't really do anything. Then Vice President Biden, who you've worked very closely with throughout this administration, went over there and made a statement that looked a little bit like we were saying, okay, China, do whatever you want. And so the question, I mean, one interpretation is that there was a subtle behind-the-scenes deal where we said we're not going to embarrass them, and they said they're going to walk this back, which would be the diplomatic solution we hope for. The other is that it looks a little chaotic, and all the countries in the region are worried about this potential set of conflicts associated with the China Sea. And I was just wondering, because you're so close to this, if you could shed some light on it.
Sure. First, David, I think this fits into a larger context of China trying to assert sovereignty and dominion in its region, in the seas, now in the skies, and taking steps to do that. What we've seen is a real backlash from China's neighbors who are concerned about this. And we've seen an expression of that backlash both in their individual relationship with China and increasingly in the preeminent institutions and organizations in Asia where China has had to defend itself against criticism, concern, and pushback against these efforts. So I think China will have to decide whether it's pushing things too far and overreaching in some of these assertions of sovereignty.
Are you implying that they did push it too far with this?
So here's what happened, and here's what this is all about. And I've learned a lot about the so-called ADIZs in the last week or two. An ADIZ is basically a zone beyond your national airspace, a kind of buffer zone that countries establish. We have them, the Japanese have them, the South Koreans have them. In fact, we actually instituted the South Korean and Japanese ADIZs after the Second World War and the Korean War. And it's a zone that allows you to create a buffer before your national airspace where planes flying into or through that zone can identify themselves if they intend to come into your national airspace. That's the purpose of it. Unfortunately, so as a basic principle, there's nothing wrong with an ADIZ per se. We have them, our partners have them. However, the way China went about this, and where it went about this, was profoundly troubling because it has the potential to destabilize things, to create confusion. First, it happened to establish its zone without consultation and coordination with its neighbors. That's not part of the practice of doing this. Second, it did it in a way that overlapped with the existing Korean, Japanese, and Taiwanese zones. That is obviously a recipe for potential confusion. Third, of course, it did it over the Senkakus, which are administered by Japan. And fourth, there was an implied threat in the way it did it that suggested that if planes were flying through the zone and didn't respect the rules that China set, there might be consequences. All of these were in a clear contradiction of our practice, of international practice. And so we made it very clear from day one that we do not respect the zone that China established. And indeed, I think as most of you know, we flew a couple of B-52s through the zone a couple of days later. So we've been very clear about it. There's no ambiguity about the fact that we are not paying heed to what was established. The question, though, is going forward, how do we avoid a situation in which China continues to do this, other countries decide to extend their zones, and this becomes a recipe for possible incidents that can lead to even worse. And so the Vice President worked very carefully and deliberately on this trip with China, with South Korea, with Japan, to try and see if we could establish some procedures where these countries would actually consult and coordinate. And if they were going to pursue these kinds of zones, or if they were going to extend the zones that they had, that they did it in a way that respects the practices that have built up over 50 years and don't make an already fraught, fragile situation in the region more difficult.
Okay. We've left a lot of the world to be covered here. Somewhere is somebody with a microphone. Why don't we start over there? And the ground rules are pretty simple. Identify yourself. Keep the question to under about 60 seconds, but you don't have to go that long. And make sure it ends with an upward inflection of your voice, so it sounds like a question. All right.
It's always dangerous starting with the journalist and asking for one question. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here.
It's easy. We actually control the microphone.
Yes, that's true, but I have a loud voice. Ian Pannell from BBC News. Mr. Blinken, we spoke earlier. I spent the last 2 years travelling inside northern Syria and essentially witnessed its descent into chaos and what is in effect a failed state. Now, critics of the administration will say that's partly as a result of the lack of Western engagement. I wonder whether you could throw some light on the President's thinking. Is he a man who has been engaged in Syria, or is he a man who has felt that the problems there are essentially too complex and he set his store by pulling out of Iraq and Afghanistan rather than his presidency? That is my question.
Thanks. I, by the way, have a hint as to, I have a sense as to where the answer is going, but is the President engaged or is he disengaged?
You'll be shocked to learn that he and the entire administration have been deeply engaged, will remain deeply engaged. And I think you'll hear from Secretary of State Kerry later about his own deep engagement. He said, look, this is a hugely difficult challenge, and there are 3 fronts that we've been operating on. We've seen most recently and most visibly the question of chemical weapons. Right now, as a result of the agreement that was reached, because we were prepared to use force to deal with the problem, Syria's capacity to produce chemical weapons has been eliminated, and the weapons that it already produced and the various munitions are on the verge of being removed from the country. That means that by early next year, if we continue to have good fortune and stay on the trajectory we're on, we will have eliminated the Syrian chemical weapons program without firing a shot. That will manifestly make every country in the region a little bit more secure, one less thing to worry about, a chemical cloud from Syria flying over their countries and wreaking havoc there. So that's been and is an ongoing success. Second, the humanitarian catastrophe that is Syria, a growing catastrophe. It's probably the worst man-made humanitarian problem since Rwanda. We see it in the 9 million Syrians who are in need. We see it now in the millions of displaced persons inside of Syria and the millions now of refugees outside of Syria who are having a dramatic impact on the countries that are good enough to receive them. The United States is and will remain the largest single humanitarian donor. We've contributed over $1.4 billion to this effort. By comparison, some other leading countries, take Russia or China, for example, have contributed in the tens of millions of dollars. We have been focused intently on doing everything we can to see if we can get that assistance into Syria to the people who need it. And this is a huge challenge because, as you know from having been there repeatedly, the lack of access, principally denied by the government, but also in some instances by various opposition groups, and then just the general chaotic environment. We worked hard to get a strong statement from the United Nations, a presidential statement from the Security Council, making clear the obligations of all the parties to allow humanitarian access. And what we've been working on is basically using that, as we use the agreement on chemical weapons, to help humanitarian workers and supplies get to where they need to go. We've seen some modest progress over the last few weeks on that, but clearly insufficient. And we're working hard to move that forward. And then finally, there's the underlying conflict itself, and what we're trying to do about it, what others are trying to do about it. It's profoundly challenging, and it's frustrating. Our assessment has been this, that the only prospect of keeping Syria together and keeping its institutions intact and preventing a vacuum that's filled by forces that in their own way could be as bad, if not worse than Assad, is through a negotiated transition that moves Assad out, moves some kind of transitional authority in, and then allows Syria to hold elections, develop, if it needs to, a new constitution, etc. And of course, the obstacle to that has been, for various reasons, the reluctance of various parties to actually negotiate. So we've been working hard to put pressure on Assad and the regime and the people who support him, to isolate them, to deny them resources, to make it more likely that they'll come to the table. Similarly, as you know, we've been working to build up the moderate opposition. This is obviously a great challenge, trying to focus the aid that we provide, the assistance that other countries provide, on the moderates to keep it away from the extremists. And it's been a difficult process. And obviously we haven't gotten to where we need to go yet. But we've also established the principles for a transition in Geneva. We now have, in January, a second Geneva conference that we hope will bring all of the parties together to see if we can actually begin to implement what was agreed in Geneva 1. Again, all of this is very difficult, time-consuming, frustrating, and meanwhile, people are suffering tremendously. I will say this, there's one interesting development that has a good side and a very bad side. The very bad side is what you alluded to, which is the increasing prominence of extremist groups inside of Syria that clearly pose a danger today and could pose an even greater danger in the future. But on the other hand, what's that's done is it's begun to concentrate the minds of critical actors outside of Syria, who, for a variety of reasons, have their own interests in preventing that future for Syria. The Russians have a profound interest in avoiding the emergence of an extremist Syria and a haven for extremist groups. Many of Syria's neighbors have the same incentive. And of course, we have a strong reason to want to avoid that future. And so there may be a convergence of interests that lead various countries to push harder than they have in the past for this political solution, for the kind of transition we need to move Assad out and to keep the country together. The test will be coming up in January in Geneva. This is something the Secretary of State is working on every single day, as well as his whole team and folks at the White House. So let's see where we get in January.
Okay, we really only have about 5 minutes left. And so if we have a brief question, a brief answer, maybe we can get two. So let's go here, and then we'll go to the back of the room.
Thank you very much. My name is Ritva Koukuron. I'm ambassador of Finland here to the US. Good morning. I would have liked to ask about transatlantic relations. The question, where will be the... Now, of course, we are heading for TTIP negotiations. NATO summit will be next year as well. Where are the priorities now in transatlantic relations during the coming months between the US and EU? And the second question is actually that what would be the agenda with Russia? Not only with some of these issues like Syria, Afghanistan, but what about disarmament issues? where will be the focus, or will there be?
Right, so the mandate here is for 60 to 90 seconds to cover the oldest and most important complicated relationship that the United States has in the world.
So I'll try and be really brief so we can get in a couple more
Yeah,
questions.
right.
One, Europe remains our partner of first resort for virtually every challenge we deal with around the world. You see that every single day. Everything we've just talked about in distant corners of the world usually starts with a conversation and coordination with our European partners. That hasn't changed, despite the much vaunted rebalancing toward Asia. That's one. Second, you alluded to TTIP. There's something very powerful going on between the TTP in Asia, the TTIP in Europe. What we just saw in Bali with the WTO was extraordinary because we haven't seen the WTO actually come together and forge an agreement in the 20 years of its existence. If we're able to come to fruition with TTP in Asia and TTIP in Europe, we'll have covered 70 to 80% of global trade in new agreements that facilitate that trade, that fuel growth in our countries, and that add dramatically to people's well-being. That core partnership with Europe is as vibrant as it's ever been. So we'll be working on that. That's very much front and center on the agenda, as well as dealing as partners with a range of security issues. Finally, with regard to Russia, it's a complicated relationship. We had to come back to where we started. In Geneva, the Russians were a very strong partner in dealing with Iran and helping to forge this interim agreement on Iran's nuclear program. That's positive. Similarly, with regard to Syria, Russia taking some ownership of the chemical weapons problem was critical to getting success there. So clearly there are areas where we can and should be working cooperatively because it's in our mutual interest. There are other areas where we will have and continue to have real friction, but there's also a clear agenda on strategic arms to see if we can get to further limitations, and that's the big challenge, I think, of the coming months and years.
Okay, very quickly, very quick question, very quick answer, please.
Hi, I'm Gulala Ismail from Pakistan, one of the global thinkers. What I want to say is that peace cannot be established in the world, and especially in Afghanistan. Extremism cannot be countered in Afghanistan until it is countered in Pakistan. And what it seems is that both the civil government and the military of Pakistan, they're not honest in countering the extremism, but it seems that they're secretly involved in supporting those militant groups. So, and we think that there should be more, a lot of military aid is coming to Pakistan from USA, so we think that there should be more sanctions on Pakistan, and there should be more ask for transparency. So my question is, what are the plans of US for making sure that the aid which is coming to Pakistan is used for countering extremism and not supporting extremism? Thank you.
Thanks very much. First of all, it's great to see an actual global thinker here. We'd like to have one or more of our own.
One of our goals at foreign policy is actually importing thinkers into Washington.
Washington can only benefit.
Yeah, right.
So we welcome that. Look, as you know better than anyone, there are many sides to this coin. First of all, Pakistan and the Pakistani people have been among the first victims of terrorism on a daily basis. And Pakistani soldiers have also put their lives on the line, put their lives down in the fight against extremist groups. On the other hand, we also see, unfortunately, efforts to hedge, to leverage, to use different groups in ways that would protect Pakistani equities. I think, to me, the most profound issue is this. We obviously are heavily criticized in Pakistan for the actions we take to try and deal with extremist groups, and there is an understandable concern expressed about Pakistani sovereignty. I would submit that the people violating Pakistan's sovereignty are the terror and extremist groups in Pakistan. And our only purpose is to help Pakistan regain its sovereignty by being able to deal with these groups and eliminate that problem. That's all that we're trying to seek to achieve. We do expend significant resources in assistance. It's profoundly in our interest for Pakistan to succeed economically. It's in our interest for Pakistan to be able to take the fight to extremists, and we support that. But there are, of course, clear checks on the way that assistance is provided. Congress has mandated them, and it's something that we in Congress look at very carefully.
Thank you very much, Tony. I think what you can see from this panel, from this discussion, is that, my joke a moment ago aside, we actually do have some leading global thinkers in the United States government, and that Tony Blinken is one of them. He obviously has a great command of a broad set of issues. We've just touched upon the surface of them, but I think he's gotten us off to a great start here. And so would you please join me in thanking Tony for coming to the